thank you all for coming. My name is Shep. I'm an English teacher over here at Nassau Center, one of the full-time faculty. And I know a lot of you from being my students or my friends, so I really appreciate you showing up today. This is a tough one for me. When I was asked to do it initially, I was like, oh, that's the kind of presentation I'm not sure I want to give. I gave one, just telling my friend Karen, years ago at North Campus, I gave kind of a free-form presentation, and Karen told me when I was done, she said, well, the good thing about this, Shep, is they'll never ask you to do that again. So here I am in front of you doing something like it again, so we'll see where this leads me. My presentation is called Never Now, Forever Anyway. And initially, this came from an idea that I've sort of abandoned, but I wanted to say a little bit about that, why it's there, and it still relates to what I'm ultimately going to say. There's a critic named Mark Fisher who was writing about a science fiction movie in which, in the 1970s, and he was an English critic, in which there's a piece of graffiti in an abandoned subway that says, "Never Now, Forever." And it struck me that this was an interesting kind of language, because I'm very interested. What I studied when I went to graduate school is something called deconstructive theory. It's very high level, like literary theory. It's very confusing, especially for me, I think. I'm always drawn to things that I don't understand that scare me. And one of the things I was interested in about that piece of language, never, now, forever, is you can read it in many different ways. But the idea that a now is never is strange, certainly. But that state of being, that there's never a now ever, is also interesting, because the way we experience time is as if we live in a now that we control. But when you look at the way time is really constructed, time is a relationship between past, present, and future. And that now moment's always slipping out of being something that you actually experience. You don't have it. And deconstructive theory is interested in, if you start to look at the way that really functions, what else don't you have when you don't have a now moment? When you don't have a direct relation to a present time that you control. Because that's what we think we know about life. But if that's not what we ever have, do we even have a self like we think we do? So that started me on my interest in this presentation. And I was going to say more about that, but I kind of moved off into some other areas. But I just wanted to kind of preface this by explaining what that is and why that's there. Secondly, I was going to show you a few slides that related to some of my earliest interests, and that related also to what I ultimately talked about. What I usually do in my classes, I'm very interested in popular culture. And when I say that, I'm interested in what, when I went to graduate school, a lot of people thought was garbage culture. I am very into superhero comic books, and I am really into professional wrestling. And let me tell you, the second one is not very well embraced by like scholarly communities. We still find that, so that can be a problem for me when I want to give talks. And I was initially going to do more with wrestling actually in this presentation, because one thing I like to do is show you how things you might think that don't have value actually do have value. My earliest memory of popular culture relates to professional wrestling. When I was, I think, 6 years old, my grandmother, I used to go to my grandmother's house, and she figures in this presentation too, because she was like a second mother to me. She lived like a block away from my house. And I would go over to her house, and she would let me watch whatever I wanted. So, of course, I liked to go to that house. And I think a week before this moment, I started watching professional wrestling. And when I was watching Florida professional wrestling, I don't know if any of you have ever known this person, I was introduced to the man called the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. He was my favorite wrestler. He's this large, very rotund, blonde-haired, for lack of a better word, redneck, who basically spoke like a black preacher. And he was a good guy, and he was part of this called the Southern Family, and they were all the good guys that would fight, the bad guy wrestlers. And boy, I saw him wrestle, and he just beat the crap out of somebody. That was my hero. The next week, I watched this show because I knew when it was coming on. I don't think my mom and dad knew I was watching this show, by the way. And Dusty Rhodes, they showed a clip. Of course, now Dusty Rhodes had traveled, I guess, to Mexico to get an award. And Dusty Rhodes is outside the ring, and he's standing in front of the camera, and they're giving him an award. And then suddenly these two men in yellow masks, these giant men, go up there and beat the crap out of him, just bloody. And I'm a little kid. Now, keep in mind, this is the 1970s. I think wrestling is completely real. And of course, I'm not alone. Because at that time, wrestling did not what they call break kayfabe. In other words, one of the fascinations of wrestling was it real? And you'd watch these guys. Now, they really did beat on each other in the ring. But the question was, is it all fabricated? Do they make up the rules in advance? Do they figure out who's going to win and lose in advance? Or is it a legitimate competition, right? So throughout the 70s and much of the 80s, that was still, of course, wrestling had been around forever. But that was a major conversation for people that loved wrestling. And then NWA wrestling, which was like Florida wrestling, they took it seriously to present it like a sport, which was really fascinating. When you're a kid and you think you're watching a sport and you're watching things that happen outside the ring, like bludgeoning people, the world seems suddenly to be a much more frightening place and fascinating, because I was like, do guys really get to walk around in yellow masks and live like, because maybe that's a cool job. But then you can just go to a supermarket and get beat up. I mean, that happens in the world. So I was terrified of this, but fast. And of course I wanted to see what happened to Dusty Rhodes. So that became kind of part of the fabric of my mythology when I was a kid, that wrestling. And honestly, it followed me all the way through. I have not matured well as a person. I still love professional wrestling, and I always have been interested in it and followed it all the way through to the point in the 80s when Vince McMahon broke kayfabe. He's the guy that owns the WWE now. He decided he didn't want to pay the insurance stuff. He could save a lot of money if he just announced that it was fake. And then they didn't have to have the same medical professionals there, the same insurance. They could use the arenas without all these fees. So he does it, and he changes the industry forever, because now it's just called sports entertainment. And it's an interesting thing because, the question about whether wrestling was real, people have very low opinions often of people that like wrestling. How can you believe it was ever real? Well, it wasn't so much that they really believed it was real. It was that tension between whether it was real or whether it was fake. That was part of the great appeal. Certainly as I got older, that was more and more interesting, because these guys really did beat on each other. They really are incredible athletes. But at the same time, the whole win-loss structure was predetermined. So after this happened, people remained fascinated with wrestling, but it's interesting. We now have a division of the kinds of fans. We say there are people who are marks. Marks are people that believe that wrestling still is real. There are usually younger, kids, may take it all seriously. There's a designation called a smark. Those are people that know it's fake but still have suspension of disbelief. They say these people are really athletes, it's worth watching for their athletic endeavors, and the drama is real whether it's real or not. And then there's people called smarts who've started a whole, and this industry is much, I'm making it sound like it just started, but for years and years and years, there have been guys who publish things called dirt sheets who have been revealing all the secrets of the industry. What happens behind the scenes in wrestling, right? And so then you can figure out, well, yeah, all this stuff's predetermined, but what are the political decisions that make it predetermined? So that division exists in wrestling fandom. And I'm telling you all this for a reason, philosophically. Because part of the question that you'll see that comes up in my own paper is, to what extent is anything real, right? So if we have something like a dirt sheet that covers the corporation of wrestling or the business side of wrestling, is the business side of wrestling something that's non-fictional? Is a corporation real, or is it agreed upon fiction, right? We've all heard the term something can just, and this is usually when the most personal thing you can be told when you're getting fired, it's just business. Well, doesn't that indicate if we think that it's just business, that there's something that's not just business, that's real? But then is business real? It's not so easy just to say there's reality and there's fiction. And one more anecdote from wrestling before I give you my talk proper. One of my favorite moments in wrestling as an older fan happened in 2011. One of my favorite wrestlers is a guy named CM Punk, who's now no longer a wrestler. But he went out on stage, sat down in the middle of on the entryway, and he just started doing supposedly what's called a shoot. In wrestling, there's a shoot and there's a work. A shoot is when you come out and say something real that was not scripted, often that can get you fired. That's like you reveal something about the real politics of the ring. A work is when you come out and do something scripted. So a work in the ring would be a scripted fight where everybody's choreographed. A shoot is when wrestlers go out and actually beat the hell out of somebody because they're teaching them a lesson. And these things do sometimes happen. And of course, fans are always like, ooh, is that real? Was that a real? Because people really do want to still believe. What CM Punk did, interestingly, is he sat down and he gave this long speech that sounded like it was all about the behind the scenes politics of wrestling, which had never just happened in the front of the camera like that before. It was like he was out there just talking about what was happening. Why wasn't he allowed to win? Why wasn't he given more merchandise? How dare they? He was the best thing in the company. He was going to quit. He was going to go to another company. He starts naming other companies who never do that in wrestling. So this was this huge moment. Of course, it increased ratings for a number of weeks because people were like, what's going on? because of course it was that whole fabric of what's real, what's fake. It was brought back. Now it was all a shoot. It was all a work. He was told to do what he did. They even cut his mic and it was all scripted. But look, what's real? That makes you think. Is there more to the way we experience reality than we think, right? Is there something to this notion that stories are something we inhabit and that inhabit us? And that really led me to where I'm going with this paper, I guess, in general. It's not a really long presentation. I've kind of developed something. I'm going to try to go slow and make it, engaging and not just like I'm reading, but that's where I am with this now. So I hope I've set it up and I hope it's interesting to you. All right. Never, now, forever, anyway. Egotism, endings, and the last lecture. I have 2 quotes. One of them is a book that I would recommend to everybody. It is one of the most interesting books I've ever read. I just read it recently. It's called Sapiens. Yuval Noah Harari, I don't know if you ever heard of this. It's a brief history of humankind. He's a historian. So I started with a quote from him. I recommend this book. It's really fascinating. He says, quote, "It is an iron rule of history that every imagined hierarchy disavows its fictional origins and claims to be natural and inevitable. Most people claim that their social hierarchy is natural and just, while those of other societies, of course, are based on false and ridiculous criteria." And my second quote is from the football player Terrell Owens, and he said, "I love me some me." One of the greatest quotes in history, I think. When I was approached about doing this lecture, my first instinct was to decline. However, 2 things stopped me. First, that my participation was voted on by my students, to whom I am so very indebted and I love so very much, and I really mean that. And second, because the concept of a last lecture has a kind of morbid appeal to me. Let's spend just a minute discussing what the last lecture series itself is. A quick perusal of our friend Wikipedia. Remember, students, never use Wikipedia as an academic source in your papers. Explains that the last lecture series is an ongoing series of lectures where top academics, and I'm not so sure I fit into that category, are asked to think deeply about what matters to them and then give a hypothetical final talk, i.e., what wisdom would you try to impart to the world if you knew it was your last chance? There was actually a book that came out of this called The Last Lecture. It was a bestseller, and it was a computer science professor named Randy Pausch, who at the time was dying from pancreatic cancer, and he gave a very inspirational talk, and the book is a very inspirational book, very popular. So that's another way that you may have heard of the last lecture series. So the premise is essentially, hey, if you died tomorrow, what would your last message be? So pretty morbid stuff, right? And interesting, what would you say if you knew you were going to die? The meaning of the word last is especially interesting to me here. On one hand, as an adjective, when describing something like a lecture given right before someone dies, it means final of a series, right? Final lecture. But as a verb from the root lasten, it can mean to go on and continue in time. When one imparts wisdom or teaches, this is where ego comes in. One hopes that somehow he or she will live on in the students who have heard, for example, one's last lecture. If this works, one's last lecture is lasting, and so isn't the last at all. And when we really break down the psychology of this hope, one realizes that not only am I, the last lecturer, hoping to live on in you, the listeners, I am also imagining that I am you, remembering myself speak. That's because it is essentially impossible for human beings to imagine their own deaths. We experience everything through our first-person perspective. I can no more experience you remembering me than I can inhabit your sense of self or see the world through your eyes. In fact, if I have a very well-developed sense of self, a big ego, I cannot imagine not existing, even though I can talk about it. In this lecture, I want to seriously consider the way that this well-developed sense of self comes to be and why it's so important to question how it works. For self-conscious beings, our stories to us seem to go on forever, even though in some sense we know that they don't. We know we're going to die. This dilemma should give us a clue that the way we experience the world as selves is fundamentally at odds with how we know the world really is, but then can't know. The last lecture then brushes right up against the topic of death and its problematic status for us as an object of contemplation. This sort of contemplation invites what's called by some philosophers existential angst, or a dread that can force us to evaluate our lives and their ultimate meaning. For me, angst and the thoughts that it inspires have been central to my life. Since I was 17 and had my first real encounter with death, my grandmother, who I mentioned earlier, who had been like a second mother to me throughout my childhood, died suddenly, and I had my first experience of what's commonly known as clinical depression and anxiety disorder, which runs deeply in my family on my mother's side. As I hope to show you, this experience, while in many ways devastating, also afforded me with a kind of wisdom that I might impart that would otherwise have been hard to come by. And it's something that I talk about quite a bit. I am always ready to speak openly about my depression and anxiety because mental illness still carries such a stigma in our culture. And the more of us who speak out, especially those who have positions that afford us the opportunity to speak at moments like this, the better for everybody. Depression is not simply a deep sadness, although mourning certainly accompanies it. It manifests differently for everyone who has it, but it arrives unannounced and it forever alters one's life world. It is a very serious condition that I think must be taken seriously, and so it's just a part of my life and who I am. For me, depression and anxiety have altered my perception of who I am and how I am oriented to the world. My first experience with these conditions was triggered, as I mentioned, after the loss of a loved one. And suddenly I had to grapple with a kind of tangible finality. And from that point on, my life has been very different. When depression and anxiety flare up in my life, I experience a strange break with my everyday world. I am suddenly unable to connect to familiar places, and my own house feels alien to me, like I don't belong there or I'm not connected to the place. I lose all sense of direction, what little direction sense I have. I sit and stare into space, unable to function. I experience moments when my body and mind seem disconnected from each other. I can feel my skin reacting to like a stimulus, but it's almost like I'm watching someone else be connected to it. At the worst moments, I am unable to immerse myself in anything other than my immediate desperate circumstance, for being a self itself suddenly requires an inordinate amount of effort to work. This weird, depressive perspective has helped me understand something fundamental about being human. When one experiences these kinds of, for lack of a better term, mental disorders, one is suddenly forced to reflect on the extent to which self-perception and personal identity really are kinds of stories, narratives we've learned to tell ourselves about ourselves. Stories authored not by ourselves, but by the culture we live in, the forces we are beholden to, the circumstances of our situations. Indeed, when one's sense of self ceases to work as it once did, he or she is suddenly confronted with the extent to which that seemingly incontrovertible truth is itself a fabrication. When that story fails to hold up, when you can't believe or adequately invest in or trust your experience of yourself, you suddenly realize the extent to which you are subject to internal forces you otherwise identify as part and parcel of your subjectivity. In other words, you realize that you aren't exactly writing the plot of your own story, that you are beholden to narrative forces beyond your control, that your story isn't yours in quite the way you thought it was, and that certain truths you took for granted about reality are themselves up for questioning. This bizarre experience of losing control of one's own story isn't really as weird or uncommon, maybe, as it sounds, although other experiences of such a loss of control are not met with as much discomfort and in fact are kind of ordinary. Indeed, if you've ever had to stand up and tell your story in a public space like this one, you already know that you aren't entirely in control of the tale you're spinning. Forces are brought to bear upon you that give the lie to authentic storytelling in those moments, even without considering some of the deeper ways that our stories are not really our own. For example, public speakers have to take into account what the audience wants or expects to hear, what the context of the talk is, what their professional position is, especially as it relates to the individual or organization that has asked them to speak. All of these factors will play into the kind of language used for the speech, the sorts of anecdotes that are appropriate, the political positions that may or may not be taken. In other words, a presenter's story is at the mercy of all the other stories in the audience and the overarching stories, political and professional, that come to bear upon every single person in attendance when they listen to you. This is the crisis of all such moments of communication, the external forces at play that challenge the myth of authentic storytelling. But even if those external forces were not in play, if, for example, I was just giving an informal talk to my best friends in a private space, there is a sense in which my story is not my own. My basic ability to refer to myself in the first person, to say I, is the result of a developmental history during which my childhood, and for lack of a better word, self, was repeatedly subject to the gaze, the will, and the language of others without being able to register the experience. Blind to this process of development, I, like all infants, was subject to an incalculable number of commands, interdictions, and other negative instructions, as well as permissions, avowals, and otherwise affirming attributions, which I internalized without knowing it. I was a kid, I was a little baby, I was an infant, I didn't know what was happening, I didn't have a self. I was formulated by my experiences to have a self and to say I. The result is the paradoxical advent of a sense of subjectivity that after it's formed seems to arise from out of itself, but that has been shaped in ways to which I will never have access. My basic experience of being self-conscious, of being able to say I to you right now, is that this consciousness seems to arise directly and immediately from out of itself. That it is present to itself in the present moment, in the now. On the other hand, this consciousness was only made possible by communicative interactions that the influence of which leave almost no representable memory traces to me. I can't remember how it was made into a self. I just know that it happened. This means that when we are children, we are, among other things, told stories about ourselves so that we may develop our inner voices, but these voices will later seem to have merely been there all along in the sound that comes out of my mouth. In my 1102 class, we talk about cultural mythologies, those belief systems that are taught that allow us to navigate the world and make sense of our place in it. In a shared culture, much about those systems may be similar, especially when it comes to basic rules like how to eat in public, dress yourself, all those things that most of our parents will teach us if we're lucky enough to have them. But other fundamental elements may be vastly different. This is why we think parenting matters, right? Children whose stories include recurrent messages that they are special and loved have vastly different stories to tell as adults than those who are made to feel that their existence is a burden or that they are a mistake. Some kids grow up with completely inconsistent stories, and their narratives end up reflecting that confusion. Of course, one story is also subject to other kinds of forces beyond one's control. Genetic predispositions to mental illness, for example, can disrupt one's narrative and break the illusion that one is a master of one's domain, even if you've had a great parenting experience. Regardless, the consequence of forces upon the developing child gives the lie to any naive belief that people are simply born into their selfhoods and then just express who they are in life. The paradox is that good parenting, whether it comes from biological parents, teachers, or some other source, and usually it's a whole bunch of them, that builds a strong sense of self in children, leads to a kind of narcissism, one that can allow for success in a competitive world, but that to some extent also closes off the possibility of hearing other people's stories, since a strong, confident self will always regard other stories as secondary to its primary first-person narrative. Good parents make their kids feel like they are the center of the universe, the authors of their stories. And this wondrous fabrication makes it possible for a person to take on the mantle of a responsible adult who contributes to a free society. It can also lead to toxic entitlement and sociopathic egotism. Lectures like this one often present audiences with optimistic messages of empowerment, reassurances that they are important and special, messages that so many of us want to hear because they bolster our egos, intensify our beliefs in the importance of our narratives, and further insist that we can control who we are. In those moments, we are affirming what we think we already know about ourselves. They underscore the supposed specialness of our first-person experience. What I would like to instead draw your attention to is the paradox at the very heart of that experience of ourselves. Let me restate the problem again. In order to survive, we all must come to believe that we are the authors of our personal stories. The more we believe that to be true, the more confident we are, the more likely we are to be happy and comfortable, the more apt we are to bank on that confidence and become successful, productive members of society. On the other hand, the more convinced we are that we are such autonomous authors, the more likely we are to dismiss the notion that our stories aren't our own, that we have been subjected to the stories told by our parents and our culture, and that we are at the mercy of inner forces we can't control, and also we disavow that in other people. We see them as authors too, totally responsible for who they are. After all, if every self-conscious person's story includes the central premise that he or she is the special, free-thinking center of the universe, what would be the value of questioning that purpose or that premise? Wouldn't that just lead to senseless anxiety and a loss of the confidence that has made a good life possible? And yet, so much of life is predicated on the collision of our stories with those of other people and other cultures. As our stories bump up against each other, challenge each other, fight for supremacy, understanding the story of our stories becomes paramount because it also forces us to consider the story of the other story and to recognize that at the very least, we all share the fact that we are at the mercy of a fundamental kind of storytelling that nobody truly controls. In his highly acclaimed book, *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind*, Noah Harari ponders how human communities were able to go from roving groups of about 150 individuals to massive conglomerations of millions of people. He says, quote, "The secret was probably the appearance of fiction, for large numbers of strangers can cooperate successfully by believing in common myths that exist only in people's collective imaginations. These shared myths include perhaps religious stories, but also modern inventions like corporations that we agree exist. Banks, we agree they exist and work. We agree that our Constitution is real. We agree every day that we, the people, are a people." He goes on to argue that these empowering fictions to succeed as organizing principles must ultimately appear as fundamental truths for us to really engage with them and believe them, explaining that it is an iron rule of history that every imagined hierarchy disavows its fictional origins and claims to be natural and inevitable. Most people claim that their social hierarchy is natural and just, while those of other societies based on false and ridiculous criteria. Stories then are at the very foundation of the cultures we inhabit, but instead of appearing to us as stories, they present as unquestionable truths. They allow us to organize and survive, but the more effective they are, the more they limit our access to their fictional foundations and thus to our capacity to imagine other kinds of stories or to consider the validity of other cultures' narratives. In a multicultural place like the United States, where so many stories abound, it's no wonder we are so often in conflict. Indeed, increasingly it seems difficult to understand exactly what we mean by this we, as our daily lives are consumed by stories of us and them. In a very real sense then, our stories on both a collective and a personal level propel us forward and prevent us from progressing. We are at their mercy, for we are born into them and then we are inhabited by them. They possess us, giving us our names and our identities, our heritages and our hopes. They empower us, telling us that we are special, convincing us that we are in fact the authors of our lives, even as the trajectory of those lives have been laid out in advance by the narrative scope of those same stories. And ultimately, insofar as they present as true, they can prevent us from imagining other stories, other groupings, other possibilities. As an English teacher, I am of course fascinated by stories, and perhaps my profession gives me some access to the strange ways they work their magic on us. On the other hand, I am also one of the primary agents responsible for indoctrinating my students into the cultural mythology of the American dream. For I am part of the cultural machine that promises people that hard work and dedication lead to success and happiness, that a college degree leads to a profitable career. At the very same time, as a person who lives with depression and anxiety, I know all too well the limits of all those kinds of stories. We are then largely what we are told, but not entirely so. As self-conscious subjects, we do not have access to those storytelling forces that made us who we are. We can never go back and experience the moments that made us believe that we are the authors of our stories, for those moments precede our existence as the subjects we are today. However, the bravest among us can at least admit to the fact that we have been constructed by forces beyond our control, and that admission also allows us to contemplate how we might work to change the narrative. As a man in his late 40s, I realize that in many ways my own story is rapidly coming to an end. As a 47-year-old man without any children, I also realize that I won't be directly shaping the formative narrative of another person, that I won't have that kind of lasting effect on a life. As a teacher, though, and specifically as a teacher of English and cultural theory, I am in a privileged position to more obliquely affect the future by recognizing and remarking on the power of language and insisting on what that means. If we want to dream of a better future, we need to recognize that those dreams are stories controlled by other stories. Stories about what it means to be better. Stories about a future that, since it is imagined within the confines of a particular culture's myths, always resembles the past from which those myths arise. The challenge for those who stand to inherit a world in chaos, one whose looming environmental crisis will require cooperation on a scale unheard of in human history, is to somehow imagine a story grand enough to inspire legions. This story cannot be yoked to the past. It must somehow transcend the myths that have led us to the precipice. It must somehow galvanize the power of first-person consciousness to get things done, while also recognizing the crippling limits blind belief in this kind of agency imposes on our ability to collaborate. It must unify rather than divide. And perhaps the only way to achieve that kind of unity is to recognize the paradoxical nature of storytelling itself and to embrace the anxiety that comes with it. If this last lecture has a lasting message, let it be that no story has to last forever. But new stories, different kinds of stories, strange and wonderful, can be told if we're brave enough to tell them. And I think my students are up to that task. Thank you. I'm glad to take some questions on all that if you want to ask me anything. Or you just want to stare at me and make me feel kind of ashamed.
Shep, can I ask something?
Yeah.
As you were talking, I started to think about how do you feel that social media is playing into storytelling?
It's fascinating because we talk about this in my class about how when you think about virtual reality, here's the fact. So I read a lot of philosophy, and some of the philosophers are always laughing when people get asking questions about virtual reality because their answer is always it's always virtual.
Right.
Well, one great example this guy Zizek gives is when you go on a first date, are you really going on a date with someone who's real? When you go on a date, when you present yourself on a first date, who are you? Is that you? And are you single? Because if it's you, that's why you're single, right? That first date, go on a date, go get married and live with somebody and go on a date. How much different is that date than the first date? Social media just kind of implements all of that. You get catfished and all that stuff, but it's because we always live in an abstract virtual reality. And I do think that we are because of things like social media, we are fragmented in a billion different ways. We're all our own little celebrities. We pay attention to our own little echo chambers. So we are even more, we consolidate who we are in some ways. We fabricate who we are based on what we see, and then we don't listen. So yeah, I think there's all kinds of possibility in social media. I don't want to be that guy that just dismisses it because I think there's new kinds of stories to be told, and it may offer up new possibilities for identity. But how we're seeing it used right now, I mean, to me it seems like it's an influence that's more toxic than it is offering possibilities. And maybe I'm wrong because I'm an old dude, and I'm losing touch with some of the way that can work. I don't want to be that guy that just says, all this new stuff that kids do is wrong. It's just a different kind of communication, but it does seem that it leads to all kinds of sadness, depression, and fragmentation. So I think that that's part of the way storytelling is hurting us, I would say. I think that's a really good thing to think about myself. Anybody else? Come at me. Yes.
So, all right, well, my brain hurts.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was able to keep up, but
I hope I didn't hurt your brain too much.
it was a struggle because it's really challenging. It's really provocative what you're talking about. And I'm thinking about kind of the genre of creative nonfiction. I'm thinking about the idea from artists, writers, that talk about getting at a greater truth through fiction, which I believe. I also think we do, in a way, author our own story that's fictionalized interpretation that suits the narrative sometimes that we're trying to push forward.
But
Does that make sense?
Does that narrative also always involve an outside influence that you are from the beginning? There isn't just a single it seems to me that the flow from self to art is always a very simplistic model, right? We are already influenced in advance.
Right.
I mean,
We're hijacking maybe a story and creating this kind of metaphorical idea that helps an agenda of pushing forward what we want to believe is really.
I guess I'm offering that hijacking already kind of assumes, though, that we're not already hijacked. You know, I mean, again, I think all the things you're saying are interesting, but, you know, art's, you know, how does art function? Where's the creative process? Where's the author in the art? You know, when does intention stop mattering? I mean, one of the myths we're talking about is the myth of intention. You know, and it's incredibly, a lot of artists want to hold on to that while also challenging the very notion that it exists. We live in what? Remix culture? You know, where people sample, where is the artist? You know, these are a hodgepodge of cultural productions where it's hard to locate where the artist is anymore. You know, the artist's identity, I think art also challenges our very notion of what identity is. And sometimes I think that it does that and the artist wants to pull it back to get recognition. And that's that ego that comes back in and says, oh, you know what, I'm special and I matter. But then art wants to explode the specialness too and say, look, we can think differently than that. So I think it's and again, I'm not arguing that we have to get rid of first-person consciousness. What would that even mean? But I think we always have to come back and ask questions about it when it reimposes itself.
Right.
You know, and look,
But
artists are
maybe
stuck in a
the
market.
artist isn't able to articulate, maybe the end result of the narrative wasn't the intended self-serving intention of the artist. Does that make sense? Like how you can critique an artist's work and not even factor in the artist may be long dead and the analysis doesn't even include the author's intention.
And that's part of the dilemma of the death of the author, right? And then, you know, how do you come back from that? Like, because that's always haunting you. Like, whenever I say something, I can be misread. Right. And then I'm saying something with a language that I don't know. I was born into a language that was in ventriloquy. I mean, someone else's words. Right. So where's the originality there? You know, my own conception of myself as a self is taught to me in advance. So I think it's fascinating to keep going back and say, wait, where's the origin of this? But it also gives us opportunities to also, you know, when we get really full of ourselves, we suddenly realize, wait a minute, what does it mean? Isn't there this other way we could reorganize or rethink that? You know? I mean, in our politics, we have, you know, you have on two different sides. You have like diversity politics and nationalism. But in many ways, what they're doing is consolidating self. Where's the we? How does it work? As a white dude, how does that work for me? I mean, there's all these ways it's problematic to stand up in front of people as a white guy right now and give a message. And I understand that. But then I have to keep talking. So where do I fit in with all of those groups? You know, with any of that? I think all of that matters in this conversation. Because the crisis is we're not listening. We are a country that has stopped listening to whatever those narratives are. And I think it might help to think about what we do share, and that is that kind of lack of control of our narratives. Maybe that's an even more fundamental kind of origin than anything else, any other thing that matters about who we are. Does that make sense? I don't know. I think there's hope in this, not just despair, although it can be a scary thing to think about losing yourself. I want it to be hopeful, not just like, oh my goodness, there's no truth. But we do kind of participate in what that truth is. At least, I think we should hope we do. I don't know if that even addresses I think it's fascinating because you come from a much more art background, and this is like in that sense, you have a different kind of connection to that.
I wasn't necessarily trying to elevate the artist and having a greater truth or greater sense of self.
Right.
What I was thinking back to was graduate school, where one of my professors, who was a poet,
right,
was discussing a work of art, and it never factored in the intent of the creator of the piece. And I asked him a question about that, and he said it's completely irrelevant. Because if there's a work of art that the creator can easily articulate the meaning or the inspiration for, then there's absolutely maybe no point in creating it to begin with.
That's it.
And so and it really, of course, it was an artist that would bother the artist and sense of self. So I agree with you on that.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that sometimes the narrative is there and it exists and it's created.
Right.
And it does have a greater sense of truth than maybe even the intention of the creation.
Right. Or what that truth is becomes so fluid, it becomes complicated, right? I mean, and his response that there's somehow an easy way to articulate anything. I mean, what would that message be? I think that's kind of off base too, because what's an easy way to articulate art? Art's always then reinterpreted by the people that see it. So there isn't going to be an easy message there. That seems like was almost like backing up against his own. I don't know.
He's a poet.
Okay.
All right.
Hey, yeah.
Why, as a country, are we losing control of our narrative? And the other part of that is, did we ever really have control?
Well, I think the second question is a great insight in the first one. What has been that narrative that we recognize, right? I mean, maybe part of it is that we are certainly now open to hearing other kinds of narratives about what it means to be American. We listen to other populations, and maybe, or people that traditionally haven't had a voice in that process, right? And it's going to be fascinating to see what that voice sounds like, because that voice could be the sound of cooperation. It could say, recognize me and let's all meet at the table and build a better future. But it could also be the message of revenge. You've taken from me for too long and now it's mine. And what's going to be, I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think that's a lot of what we discuss. Or this is mine and I'm not giving it to you, because if you can recognize as your group and that's your identity, then I'm going to recognize as my group and you're not taking it. Well, that's going to lead us to destruction. That's where we head. So I think your question is great, and I think that second part, like what is that message? Was that message always just a message of a certain kind of power? How do you share the power? How do you reimagine what that power is? How do you reimagine your community is what you're kind of asking, and I think that's the most important question of all, right? I totally am with you on that. And I don't know, I'm not smart enough to know the answers to the horrible questions I asked, so. Anybody else want to ask me anything? I mean, I'm probably getting too intense when I answer, so I'm sorry.
What do you think about Jack and Jerry Briscoe?
Oh my goodness, Jack and Jerry Briscoe, the Briscoe brothers. I just remember watching them and always wondering why they looked so goofy, like why they were great wrestlers, but they were also charismatic like Dusty Rhodes. Old wrestlers like that, they didn't have to look good to be heroes, which was fascinating.
I thought Jack and Jerry Briscoe were gorgeous in that.
Really? I only know them
Dusty
probably as old.
Rhodes was goofy looking.
I thought Dusty was gorgeous.
Is he still alive?
He died, unfortunately. His son, though, has started a new company called AEW. His name is Cody Rhodes. And they're going to challenge. It's going to be interesting. So he's changing the face of the industry in some way. There's a wrestling question, probably better than any of the other ones, right? Anybody else? Anybody? Yeah?
Who are your top 3 favorite wrestlers of all time?
Oh, my goodness.
Hardest question.
My favorite wrestler, honestly, because of who I think for me, because he reignited my interest in wrestling, was CM Punk. But probably Dusty Rhodes is my favorite, the one that influenced me the most. The bad guy he fought was a guy named Kevin Sullivan. He was a guy that pretended to be a Satanist, and he was scary as hell. So I guess, I don't know if I'm just a favorite, but I certainly was influenced by him. And then, I don't know how you don't love The Rock. Like, when I watched, it was entertaining of the rest. On the mic, that had to be one of the greatest ever. So I guess those are easy answers, but probably still the ones that float to the top of my mind. Good wrestling question. I should do a whole wrestling. That would be great. Oh, hey, yeah.
Are we allowed to ask personal questions?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I've taken from you before, but I didn't realize you dealt with depression and anxiety. I just was wondering what's gotten you through the toughest times.
I think that's a great question, and it's when it's at its worst, it feels like there is no getting through it. Honestly, I was very lucky when I first had depression. I was stuck. I was a very active youth, and when I was 17, my grandmother died. And it's so hard to talk about this because it manifests so differently in everybody, but it's so important to talk about it. When you have depression and then you get out of depression, it's very difficult to remember what it was like to be a self that was in depression. I can remember that I couldn't get off a couch, and the kinds of things I remember as experiencing was like a vortex of everything I loved just falling into it. I guess you try to figure out ways that you would interpret what you're experiencing. And I was very lucky to have parents that really paid attention to me. And so they sent me to a doctor at the time. And I took something called imipramine. It's a very early kind of medicine. I had to take it for years. One of the things that got me through was first knowing that it was a disease. Because what you really experience it as is hopelessness for no reason, but you don't necessarily think about it at the time. You're just life is meaningless. I'm not energized. I don't want to do anything. And I was never like that before. It was something that was thrust upon me from inside of me. People think that that's the best way I can describe it. And I've had so many students that when they come to me, I realize they have similar symptoms of what I had, but they don't have parents that pay attention to them necessarily. They're not in a situation where they can get the kind of help they need. And one of the reasons I like to talk about depression is I am existing in depression and I have a good life. But you have you have to kind of trust in things like you can go get medicine. The medicine doesn't immediately work. It takes time. But you know what? The fact that it took time mattered to me because I didn't feel immediately better. And they kept saying, yeah, but you will. And it wasn't like you woke up and you're happy. It's like slowly the world starts to come back into focus for you and you become who you were again. And once I started to feel different, I knew that something was happening that was making me better. And then I have to talk about it to feel better. I have to say that I have depression. I have to talk to other people that have depression and anxiety, and that also helps because you're not crazy. It's real. And there's some ways that you can look at that depressive experience also as a kind of truth. You know, you are seeing the world, you're seeing through certain kinds of stories that are real. You know, it's not that you're insane or that you're stupid. It's that this is another way of looking at the world that's unpleasant in the world that we live in, but you can get better. And it's chemical, it's got all that, it's a disease. And when you think about it that way, you'll get through it. Because if you don't think it's a disease, you won't believe that you're going to get better. And that's all part of it too, because it really is chemical in all these different ways. And so you start taking medicine and it makes you feel better. But if you don't believe it's a disease, you're not going to take the medicine, you're not going to give yourself the chance to get better either. And it's hard to take a medicine for something that is you. What does that even mean? That still is one of the most disturbing things about it. That I could feel a way and take a medicine and not feel that way. Because I think I control that, right? I think that somehow I'm in control of myself. And I think depression shows you you're not. You have to accept that, and then you accept that you can get help for it. And then communicate about it. Talk to people and tell your story, and the people that love you listen, and they make you better. And it does get better, thank goodness. It's a great question. And you have a community of people with depression that will be your closest friends ever when you meet them. I mean, because you know something that other people just can't know. Well, that was probably kind of, yeah.
I got a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you like comic book heroes.
Yes, that's it.
So if you could add to your own narrative and be one of the comic book heroes,
Oh,
which one
man.
would you be, or what one would you
Ooh, that's another,
So
that's a tough one
What
for me.
powers would you have?
Well, you know, it's funny. My favorite superhero was always Batman. Because, you know, I guess it's the conservative side of me. He's a libertarian superhero. So that part of me like loved the way that it's self-empowerment. And it's all the things that I'm talking not about the centralized ego. Probably the character I often feel the most like is Peter Parker in Spider-Man because his huge sense of responsibility and guilt and he can't get out of that, right? What one would I want to be? I'd better not answer the Punisher. That would be a bad answer, I think. I don't know, man. I like all of them so much. So let me try to give you an answer of one that I can definitively say. I will say Captain America.
Right answer.
I love Captain America because Captain America is a vision of America that I think is beautiful because it's not any one vision. And I think the way they play him in the movies is just perfect. You know, he's got an idealism, but he's also got a kind of realism about him. And he's inspiring in his way, and I think he leaves America open for enough interpretation that it works. So,
And he's got a cool shield.
yeah, and he's got a cool shield. And he looks like Chris Evans, so I'll take all that, right? Okay. My favorite wrestler is The Rock, and I want to be Captain America. That was like... Anybody else got a question for me? Well, I thank you guys so much for coming. I know I talked about a lot of crap.